The United States does not have a China policy, it has two China policies, and they are at war with each other. On one side, Washington. The politicians, the national security establishment, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, they see China as an existential threat, a rival, an adversary. They want confrontation, decoupling, containment, Cold War 2.0. On the other side, Wall Street, the corporations, the investment banks, the Fortune 500 companies, they see China as a market, an opportunity, a profit center. They want engagement, trade, investment, business as usual. These two camps are fighting, and the fight is paralyzing American-China policy. The result: the United States has no coherent strategy. It is simultaneously trying to contain China and do business with China. These goals are contradictory, and China is exploiting the contradiction. This internal civil war is not theoretical. It plays out every day in policy decisions. Washington passes laws to restrict technology exports to China. Wall Street lobbies to weaken the restrictions. Washington imposes tariffs on Chinese goods. Wall Street pressures for exemptions. Washington sanctions Chinese companies. Wall Street finds workarounds. Washington tries to rally allies against China. Wall Street makes deals with Chinese state-owned enterprises. This is not a unified country pursuing a strategic goal. This is a divided country where different factions pursue incompatible objectives, and the division is getting worse. Let me start with Washington's position. The national security establishment views China as the primary threat to American power. This is bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats agree on almost nothing, but they agree on China. China is building a military that can challenge the United States in the Western Pacific. China is developing technologies, AI, quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, biotech, that could give it strategic advantages. China is expanding its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, buying infrastructure in developing countries, creating dependencies. China is building an alternative financial architecture, BRICS, the yuan, CIPS, to challenge the dollar. China is challenging the liberal international order that the US built after World War II. For Washington, this is unacceptable. Washington's policy prescription is containment, the same strategy the US used against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Restrict China's access to advanced technology. Limit China's military expansion. Build alliances to encircle China. Decouple economically to reduce dependence. Make China pay a price for aggression, whether against Taiwan, in the South China Sea, or in Xinjiang. Washington wants to slow China's rise. Ideally, stop it. And if China continues on its current path, prepare for conflict. This is the logic driving policy. The CAIAS Act, which subsidizes domestic semiconductor manufacturing and restricts chip exports to China. The Inflation Reduction Act, which prioritizes domestic supply chains and excludes Chinese companies from subsidies. Export controls on advanced semiconductors, AI chips, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, banning imports from Xinjiang. Increased military spending focused on the Pacific. The AUKUS alliance with Australia and the UK to counter China. Strengthening ties with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and India. All of this is containment. Washington is building a cage around China. But here is the problem. Wall Street does not want containment. Wall Street wants profits, and profits come from China. China is the world's second largest economy. China is the largest consumer market for many products. China is the manufacturing hub for global supply chains. American companies make enormous amounts of money in China. Apple sells iPhones in China. GM sells more cars in China than in the US. Starbucks has thousands of stores in China. Tesla's largest factory is in Shanghai. Boeing sells planes to Chinese airlines. Qualcomm sells chips to Chinese phone makers. Nvidia sells GPUs to Chinese data centers. Blackstone invests in Chinese real estate. Goldman Sachs does deals with Chinese state banks. The list goes on. For these companies, China is not an adversary. China is a customer, a partner, a profit engine. Wall Street's position is simple: do not screw this up. Do not kill the golden goose. Yes, China is a strategic competitor. Yes, there are human rights concerns. Yes, there are national security issues. But business is business. You can compete with China and still do business with China. You can criticize China's government and still sell to Chinese consumers. The world is not black and white. You can have managed competition, strategic engagement, pragmatic coexistence. Wall Street believes that Washington's containment strategy is economically suicidal. If you decouple from China, you lose access to the largest market. You lose supply chain efficiency. You increase costs. You reduce competitiveness. American companies will be hurt. The American economy will be hurt, and for what? To slow China's rise by a few years. China will keep growing anyway. You are just punishing yourself. So Wall Street lobbies. Intensely. Corporate lobbyists swarm Washington. They meet with congressmen. They meet with senators. They meet with White House officials. They make campaign contributions. They fund think tanks. They commission studies showing the economic costs of decoupling. They argue for exemptions, for carve-outs, for delays. Every time Washington proposes a restriction on China, Wall Street pushes back. When the Kuiper Act was being drafted, semiconductor companies lobbied to ensure they could still sell older chips to China. When export controls on AI chips were proposed, Nvidia and AMD lobbied for exemptions. When tariffs were imposed, companies lobbied for waivers. Wall Street is not trying to stop Washington's China policy. Wall Street is trying to water it down. Make it toothless. Preserve the business relationship while allowing Washington to posture, and Wall Street is winning. Not completely, but enough. Look at the outcomes. The Kuiper Act restricts advanced semiconductor exports to China, but companies can still sell older chips. China cannot buy the latest 3-nanometer chips, but China can buy 14-nanometer chips. That is still advanced enough for many applications. The export controls have loopholes. Companies are finding ways around them. Setting up subsidiaries. Licensing technology. Selling through third countries. The tariffs on Chinese goods have exemptions. Thousands of product categories are exempt. Companies lobbied for these exemptions, and they got them. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act bans imports from Xinjiang, but enforcement is weak. Companies self-certify that their supply chains are clean. There is little verification. Wall Street is not defying Washington. Wall Street is complying minimally, following the letter of the law while violating its spirit. Washington passes laws. Wall Street hires lawyers. Guess who wins? This creates a schizophrenic policy. The US is simultaneously trying to contain China and engage with China. Washington makes tough speeches about standing up to Beijing. Then American companies announce billion-dollar investments in China. Washington imposes sanctions on Chinese tech companies. Then American investors buy shares in those same companies through Hong Kong shell corporations. Washington calls China a threat to democracy. Then Wall Street hosts conferences in Shanghai celebrating US-China business ties. The message is incoherent, and China is not stupid. China sees the division. China knows that Wall Street is not aligned with Washington, and China exploits it. How does China exploit it? By leveraging access to its market. China has 4 billion consumers. China is the growth market for many industries. If you are an American company, you need China. If China cuts you off, you are in trouble. Your stock price drops. Your investors panic. Your executives get fired. China knows this. So China uses market access as a weapon. If an American company does something China does not like, supports Taiwan, criticizes Xinjiang, pulls out of China, China retaliates, not always directly, sometimes subtly. Regulatory delays, surprise inspections, tax audits, consumer boycotts orchestrated through social media. The message is clear: play along or pay the price. This puts American companies in an impossible position. Washington wants them to stand up to China. Wall Street wants them to make money in China. You cannot do both. So companies try to walk a tightrope. Publicly they comply with Washington's restrictions. They release statements about human rights and values. Privately, they lobby Washington to weaken the restrictions. They reassure Beijing that they are still committed to the Chinese market. They donate to both political parties. They hedge. And in hedging, they satisfy no one. Washington sees them as greedy and unpatriotic. Beijing sees them as untrustworthy. But the companies do not care. As long as they can keep making money, they will keep playing both sides. Let me give you specific examples. Apple. Apple's supply chain is deeply integrated with China. Most iPhones are assembled in China by Foxconn. Apple sells tens of millions of iPhones per year to Chinese consumers. China is Apple's third largest market after the Americas and Europe. When Washington imposed export controls on advanced chips, it threatened Apple's supply chain. Apple lobbied hard for exemptions. Apple argued that restricting chip exports would hurt American companies, not just Chinese companies. Apple got partial exemptions. Apple can still source chips from China for certain products. Meanwhile, Apple is also diversifying, moving some production to India and Vietnam. Not because Apple wants to leave China, but because Apple needs to appear to be reducing China exposure to satisfy Washington and investors worried about geopolitical risk. Apple is hedging, keeping one foot in China while putting the other foot elsewhere. This is not a strategy. This is risk management. Tesla. Tesla's Shanghai factory is its largest and most productive. Tesla sells more cars in China than in the US. Elon Musk has praised China repeatedly. He has called Chinese workers the hardest working in the world. He has cozied up to Chinese officials. Why? Because Tesla needs China. If China turned against Tesla, encouraged consumers to boycott, imposed regulatory obstacles, Tesla's stock would crash. But Musk also knows he cannot fully alienate Washington. Tesla benefits from US subsidies and government contracts, so Musk plays both sides. He praises China to Beijing. He waves the American flag in Washington. He is the ultimate hedger, and it works. For now. Goldman Sachs. Goldman has deep ties in China. Goldman does deals with Chinese state-owned enterprises. Goldman helps Chinese companies raise capital. Goldman invests in Chinese startups. But Goldman also has to navigate Washington's restrictions. When Washington imposed sanctions on certain Chinese companies, Goldman had to cut ties, publicly. Privately, Goldman found workarounds, using subsidiaries, using partners. The deals continue, just with more steps, more complexity, more legal fees. Goldman is not unique. Every major Wall Street bank does this. JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, they all want China exposure. They all navigate Washington's restrictions. They all lobby for softer policies. Now let me explain why this division is so damaging. A divided policy is a weak policy. If the US had a unified China strategy, either full engagement or full containment, it could execute that strategy effectively. But the US has neither. It has half measures, restrictions with loopholes, tariffs with exemptions, sanctions with workarounds. This does not hurt China. This hurts the US, because China is not confused. China has a clear strategy: grow economically, build military power, expand influence, challenge the US-led order. China executes this strategy consistently. The US does not. The US is paralyzed by internal conflict. Second, the division weakens alliances. US allies are watching. They see Washington passing tough laws on China. They see Wall Street undermining those laws. They see American companies continuing to invest in China while Washington tells allies to decouple. This creates resentment and mistrust. If the US is not willing to decouple from China, why should Europe? Why should Japan? Why should South Korea? Allies start to hedge.